So Joshua chapter 12 and chapter 13 is what we're going to look at today as we continue our study on Joshua and the identification and formation of Israel. And so this is a chapter, a lot of times when you're looking at chapters like this that are largely just a list of names. By the way, if you have a Bible like I do, English Standard Version, it just has a big clump. It's hard to read. The Christian Standard Bible just lays it out really beautifully. So if you're ever looking at a list of something very massive, or you're doing the Bible reading, for Thomas Road, and you get to that section, just switch over for the Christian Standard Bible for just a little bit, and then go back to your favorite version, be it ESV or whatever you prefer. So just a little tip there. But we're not going to read this entire passage today because there's some really good information and interesting information, but a lot of it's quite repetitive. We're just going to get a little taste of it because we want to try to understand what God is saying to us through this, why it was important and relevant to include in the book of Joshua, and what we can learn about Israel as Israel is being formed. So, that being said, would somebody go ahead? Well, actually, first, a little bit of a background and a reminder just to catch up, because it has been a week. At the end of Joshua chapter 11, of course, they go up, and previously had conquered the south because of what the Gibeonites did. The Gibeonites betrayed this massive city-state area, this coalition of city-states, and so they gathered together to attack Israel, and instead Israel defeated them. And of course, then the northern coalition as well heard about all of this, gathered forces, and attacked. And after that, we looked at Joshua chapter 11, and it of course said in verse 20, "For it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle." But up to this point, mostly, except for the people at Ai, all of the fights and all the battles that has been fought were people that had planned to or were currently going up against Israel. I guess Jericho is kind of an exception there as well. But that changes after this. And another change that happens is at the very end of Joshua chapter 11. Would someone read the last verse in Joshua chapter 11 for us as a refresher?
So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had said to Moses. And Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Then the land rested from war.
All right, so, and we looked at this previously. It looked like from Joshua chapter 11, it says right there, Joshua took the whole land, he gave it for an inheritance, and the land had rest for war. And that kind of sums up. And if that's all we had, if Joshua ended right there, you think, okay, well, that's just the end. They'd conquered everybody, they'd taken everything, there was no resistance. We're going to find out in the next two chapters, well, actually more than just the next few chapters, that that's not accurate. That doesn't mean that God's word lied to us. It doesn't mean that it's deceiving us. What this is, it's an idiom. And so, have you ever used the phrase "sleep like a baby"? Now, how do babies actually sleep?
Wake up all the night.
Yeah, so if you're like, "Man, I really slept like a baby last night." Oh, I'm so sorry. You woke up every few hours screaming and crying and hungry and had to be fed. Go to the bathroom and do that, and then you put that back to bed, maybe sung a nursery rhyme. That's not what you meant, right? That's how babies sleep, though. That's the way idioms work, is that we have, every single language has them. The Jewish people had them as well. And so an idiom, normally, it's very clear to the original audience. If I said, "Oh man, I really slept like a baby," you wouldn't be concerned about my lack of sleep. You'd be like, "Well, that's great. I'm glad you slept really well." And I did sleep like a baby last night, in a good way. But other cultures, if you're talking to somebody that was perhaps from South Africa, and you said, "I slept like a baby," they would be like, "I'm sorry, I'm confused. Why are you saying this?" And so this expression right here, both that they conquered or they took the whole land and the land had rest from war, that is one of those idiomatic expressions, not just in the Jewish language, but in the ancient Near East. So the ancient Near East, includes Egypt down this way, and includes really all more than just the Levant. And so it includes this massive area that we think of as extending through the Middle East. And back in that day, there's a lot of different languages, a lot of different cultures that have the same language. And when they say that the land had a rest from war, that they took the entire land, what they mean is that the enemy has been so subdued that no longer are they having to go on the defensive at all. That the things have shifted, that people are pinned up in cities, or they're just in small isolated pockets and groups, or that they just have no intention, no desire to go up against the people that had conquered them. And so that is what happens here at the end of Joshua chapter 11. This is the last time where Israel is going to be attacked. The rest of the time, there are still pockets to mop up. There are people that are not taken over. There are people that are not conquered, but they will not go on the offensive against Israel. And so really that's what it's saying. And so when you're reading Joshua 12 and 13, understand that this is not contradicting. The Bible is not contradicting itself. It's just that's a sleep like a baby statement that was very obvious for anybody that was reading it in the ancient Near East. But for us, living 2,500 years later, or more closer to 3,000 years later, more than 3,000 years, in a very different culture, in a very different language, it's hard for us to understand. All right, any questions on that? We're going to go ahead and go into Joshua chapter 12 then. And we are going to read some of these verses. So would someone read for us, and there's a bunch of names here, so if you love reading names, verses 1 through 6.
These are the kings east of the Jordan River who had been killed by the Israelites and whose land was taken. Their territory extended from the Arnon Gorge to Mount Hermon, and included all the land east of the Jordan Valley. King Sihon of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, was defeated. His kingdom included Arior on the edge of the Arnon Gorge, and extended from the middle of the Arnon Gorge to the Jabbok River, which serves as a border for the Ammonites. This territory included the southern half of the territory of the Gilead. Sihon also controlled the Jordan Valley and regions to the east, from as far north as the Sea of Galilee to as far south as the Dead Sea, including the road to Beth Jeshimoth and southward to the slopes of Pisgah. King Og of Bashan, the last of the Rephaites, lived at Ashtaroth and Edrei. He ruled a territory stretching from Mount Hermon to Selakah in the north, and to all of Bashan in the east, and westward to the borders of the kingdom of Geshur and Maacah. This territory included the northern half of Gilead, as far as the boundary of King Sihon of Heshbon. Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the Israelites had destroyed the people of King Sihon and King Og. Moses gave their land as a possession to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh.
All right, so going back to our map, what this is basically talking about is this chapter is focused on the eastern possession, so east of the Jordan River. And the reason why I believe that the Bible is spending extra time here, this is actually going to come up and be a huge controversy in the last part of Joshua, and we're going to get to that in a few weeks. But this is not this side right here is not part of the allotment that God gave Abraham and his descendants. And so really when the Israelites came in to the promised land, they didn't come this way, of course. They came this way through Moab, and there was, of course, conflict there. It mentions that actually a little bit in this chapter. But that's a whole story with Balaam. You're familiar with that. And when they got up into this area right here, this is controlled by Sihon, this whole Jordan River Valley area. And very prosperous kingdom, very numerous. And this was in early part of Deuteronomy. It talks about this, where Moses and the people of Israel come up and they say, hey, we just are passing through. We don't want to take anything. We're not going to conquer anything. We'll just stick to the main roads. And if anyone does take any, it doesn't mention this, but any like chickens and donkeys, if there's any kind of issue at all, we're going to pay for that completely. We just would like freedom to pass through. And so they were not intending to take over this area, but Sihon and the people that lived in this area ended up saying, you know what, we don't trust, for whatever reason, they attacked the Israelites. And so the Israelites defended themselves and then ended up taking over the land, devoting to destruction everything except for the livestock. So they got quite a few livestock, took over all the cities, and then shortly after that, Og from the north ended up attacking the Israelites as well, and so the same thing happened there. And it mentions that he was one of the last Rephaim. Any idea what that means?
Is it the giants?
Yes, yeah, your translation might actually have it as a giant as well. It records the dimensions and actually what his bed is made of in Deuteronomy as well. And it says his bed is made of iron. And the reason why that's significant is back in this day and age, they did not know how to extract iron except from one source, and that was meteorites. That was something that it was clear because of Genesis that we looked at a long time ago that they could do before the flood. After the flood, they had lost that, and it had not been fully recovered at that time. And so they could extract meteoric iron and melt that or smelt that into things. and use it in that way, but they couldn't actually extract it from any other material. And so, are there a whole lot of meteors, you think, that are just laying around all over in no, very rare. And so that's where some of these different languages and cultures throughout the world, that they have myths and stories about magic swords. And a lot of that, there's always, with those sort of things, the Bible is wholly true. With the other myths and legends from other cultures, there's normally a kernel of truth. And the kernel of truth there is, when you have an iron sword and everybody else has swords made of copper or bronze or just wood, it's like magic. So this guy, iron was incredibly valuable, incredibly valuable. And so this guy had a bed that was, I believe, 10 feet by 13 feet across. It's put in cubits there in Deuteronomy, and it's made of iron. So it's showing his wealth, his stature, and just how massive he is. And so these were not just minor kingdoms that Israel had taken over, but they hadn't even planned to do that. But they were attacked, they defended themselves, they had taken the land. And so this was just a reminder of what God did when Moses was still leading Israel. All right, I'm going to read this portion, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit in verses 7 and 8. And these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the people of Israel defeated on the west side of the Jordan. So the first half was under Moses, east side of the Jordan. This is west side, and this is not a wholly... it's a very extensive list. We'll just put it that way. But I'm not going to read the whole thing to it. So from Baal-Gad into the valley of Lebanon to Mount Halek that rises towards Seir, that's the Edomites down south. And Joshua gave their land to the tribes of Israel as a possession according to their allotment in the hill country, in the lowland, in the Arba, in the slopes, in the wilderness, in the Negeb, in the land of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and then it goes through the list. And so basically the idea is all of this right here is what it's talking about. And it doesn't mean that every single area was conquered. We're going to look at that here in the next chapter. But basically, mostly along the coast, and Jerusalem as well was not fully conquered. They defeated an army but not actually taken the city. And then down south was not fully conquered as well. But pretty much everything else was, except for pockets here and there. And so the way it goes through and describes this is this is a pattern. I'll just read a little bit of it. It says, the king of Jericho won, the king of Ai, which is besides Bethel, won, the king of Jerusalem won, the king of Hebron won, the king of Jarmuth won. And so it's giving a whole list and counting up all of these. And at the very end of chapter 12, it says, in all 31 kings. So it's a whole list of all the different little city-states and groups of people that they conquered. But let's go ahead and look at chapter 13 now. And would someone go ahead and read for us? There's a lot of names here as well. Verses 1 through 6 in chapter 13.
Well, I'll take the plunge.
All right. Since you're leaving, you might as well, right? If you mess up, you don't have to see us for a while.
Now Joshua was old, advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, "You are old, advanced in years, and there remains very much land yet to be possessed. This is the land that yet remains, all the territory of the Philistines and all that of the Jeshurites, from Sihor, which is east of Egypt, as far as the border of Ekron northward, which is counted as Canaanite. The 5 lords of the Philistines, the Gazites, the Ashdodites, the Ashkelonites, the Jittites, and the Ekronites. Also the Hivites from the south, all the land of the Canaanites, and Mira that belongs to the border of the Amorites. That belongs to the Sidonians as far as Aphek, to the border of the Amorites. The land of the Gebalites and all Lebanon toward the sunrise, from Baal-Gad below Mount Hermon as far as the entrance to Haman. All the inhabitants of the mountains, from Lebanon as far as the brook Mizraphoth, and all the Sidonians. Them I will drive out from before the children of Israel. Only divide it by lot to Israel as an inheritance, as I have commanded you.
Can you read verse 7 as well? Sorry.
Now therefore divide this land as an inheritance to the 9 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh.
Oh, all right. So good reading. Good on the names. A lot of names there, but it's trying to give the idea. Well, let me ask you it this way: is the land fully conquered. No. It's been subdued. No one is going on the offensive. But yeah, if you were in chapter 11 and then you read chapter 13 right after that, where it's like, oh, they've had rest from war, they fully conquered the land, and then chapter 13, well, wait a minute, what happened? And it's not that, again, that the Bible is in confusion. It's not that there's, some people think that there's two different writers for Joshua and they're just really mixed up. That doesn't make any sense either. Instead, it's those people have been subdued, but they've not been fully conquered. And so, for instance, it mentioned Jerusalem. I read that in chapter 12, and it will specifically mention Jerusalem a bit later. And of course, in David's time, that's when they actually take over Jerusalem. They defeated an army in Jerusalem. I believe that they actually slayed the king, but they've not taken over the actual town itself. And so a lot of the area that's mentioned, as I mentioned, is closer to the coast. Those Philistine cities are right here, and those are going to come up very often in Israeli history. So these areas that they end up not fully conquering, they are going to actually play very prominently, unless they're conquered soon, and some of them are, in Israel's history in a very negative way. And so there's a reason why God had told them to take over and drive out these areas. So what was Joshua told to do at this point, though, even though they had some unconquered land?
To divide the land.
And that, what does that mean or imply?
Inheritance of for the tribes.
Right. Yeah, and so just like we see on the map, that's where they would establish their borders and say, well, this tribe gets this tribe gets that. Why would they do it that way instead of just saying, we're all of the people of Israel, you just live wherever you want, have at it? What advantage is there in having this, where you have the individual tribes in different areas and designated spots, versus just, anywhere in Israel is fine, you guys go for it?
They wanted to keep their tribal identity, which could have been unique. I can't come up with anything other than the Levites, which had no land.
Yeah, man, those Levites.
Yeah.
We'll actually talk about them in just a minute. Charlotte?
Another thing too is for history, say like right now, it's important that this land did belong to these people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something they could historically look at. And the land, the way it worked for Israel was a little different, that while you could sell it, really that's closer to a lease in almost every instance, because at the year of Jubilee, it would revert to the original owner. And so it would always be of someone of Reuben, or always be of someone of Ephraim, although Simeon was kind of gobbled up by Judah. But the point is basically you would not just move around a lot. You would be in your tribal land in some area in that, and have that land in perpetuity. So is there any advantage, though, to that sort of system versus if they just said everybody beyond the history, beyond the identity?
Well, really, in some ways, the Americans today do the same thing. We're not American, and we always list the country of our origin or from our ancestors. Like we're Italian American, we're English American, German American, and we kind of hold on to that ancestry. I don't know if that was there or that answers your question, but we do the same thing in our country.
Yeah, and that's very similar. Now, one other thing that's similar with our country as well is prior to the Revolutionary War, and even all the way through up until the Civil War, if you had asked an American where they were from, like if you were from another country, let's say, and you were like, oh, where do you come from? An American would not say, I'm from the United States of America. They wouldn't say, I'm from the USA or anything like that. They'd say, oh, I'm from Virginia, or I'm from Maine, or I'm from Delaware. Well, yeah, I'm an American too. But the main way that they thought of themselves was based on where their state was. And that really did not change until the Civil War. And so it's kind of interesting. And most, just like we know our early history pretty well here, because you guys are living in Virginia, just like the cradle of history. It's wonderful. I'm living here too. It's great. I read about this place. It's like a fairy tale, coming here and actually seeing some of these sites.
Yeah, but you're an Eskimo.
Oh, yeah. But I can still love it, except the heat. But this weather, man, it's so nice right now. But the state significance is that a lot of times states were good at different things, or they had different focuses. They had things that they found more important. It was easier for them to focus on these certain things. And with Israel in particular, while they were united, while there were 12 tribes, and Joshua and Moses and many others as well would remind them of that and would need to remind them of that, one advantage of this is if a certain group says, you know what, we're going to go follow those false gods, we're going to go follow those other people, we're not going to follow the way of the Lord, then the whole rest of Israel could react against that. And it was easier to either cut them off or allow them to be cut off or attack them. And there's actually some of that happens in Judges quite a bit. In Joshua, we're going to see a little precursor of that when we look at the East tribes versus the West tribes. It can cause some issues as well, but a lot of times it allows them to also focus on these individual areas. So what we're going to see also in the rest of Joshua is that it's not just the coast in the south that hasn't been fully conquered. There's spots in the north that haven't as well. And it'll even mention some areas out east, which they don't have to conquer, by the way. But having Judah, for instance, just in this area means that Judah is going to be very focused on perhaps taking Ashkelon. Whereas if it was like everybody's responsibility, guess what? Nothing gets done. So when we're doing the VBS dinner, I'm sure if you're telling everybody what to do, you're not just going to say, okay, here's a list of jobs, have at it, and let everybody do whatever. You'll probably say, hey, why don't you do this and why don't you do that, unless some people step up. Because the easiest way to lead is to tell people like specific designated tasks or to give them an area like, hey, could you do something here in this area, versus just saying, we have all these issues and problems, and so everybody just go after it, because it's just a mess that way. So these individual tribes at this point, that land being rest from war, they will not fight as one entire group ever again under Joshua. They come close in the east versus west division. And instead they focus on those tribal allotments. And this inheritance that Joshua gives them, it's not an inheritance that they fully have yet for most of these groups. It's one that they have to go fight and win and defeat the enemies, because there's still enemies there. And so if they want their inheritance, they have to go and take it as well. And so in a sense, this is a promise from God. And so in verse 6 as well, as Phil was reading, how did God say that he would help the Israelites with these remaining people that would be in the land?
He would drive them out.
Yeah. And so does that mean that the Israelites don't have to do anything, that they just wait, and when God gives them the go and says, all right, it's all cleared out, come on in? No, they would have to do their part as well. But God was actively driving them out. God was actively fighting for Israel. And so this land was theirs if they wanted to take it. And in some places, it just didn't happen. And it talks about that here a little bit as well. I'll read this section in verses 8 through 14. And this is focused again on the eastern side. With the other tribes and the half of the tribe of Manasseh, Reubenites and Gadites received their inheritance, which Moses gave them beyond the Jordan eastward, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them from Aroer, which is on the edge of the valley of Arnon, and the city that is in the middle of the valley, and all the tableland of Medeba as far as Dibon, and as far as the cities of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon, as far as the boundary of the Ammonites, the Gilead, and the region of the Gershonites, the Maccathites, and all Mount Hermon, and all of Bashan to Salika, and the kingdom of Og and Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth, and in Ed-Derai. He was alone left of the remnant of Rephaim. These Moses had struck and driven out. Yet the people of Israel did not drive out the Geshurites or the Maccathites, but Gesher and Maccath dwell in the midst of Israel to this day. And to the tribe of Levi alone, Moses gave no inheritance. The offerings by fire to the Lord, the God of Israel, are their inheritance, as he said to them. All right, so it mentions these tribes in the east, that they did a good job of driving out most people, but there's two groups of people they didn't drive out. It says that they lived with the Israelites to that day. Is that something that God had warned against, or is that something that's okay?
He warned against it.
All right, how so, Faye?
But didn't he tell them all to drive out all of the people? Don't leave anybody?
Yes, but this side, remember, and it was a trick question. I knew somebody was going to say it, so don't feel dumb, because actually more than just a few months ago, I would have gotten this wrong as well. This was not given to Israel originally. So this right here is not part of the promised land. And so these people that are living with them, they are outside of the promised land. And according to Deuteronomy, where it was instructing them to drive out the people and not make a covenant with them, It let them know, like, hey, anybody outside of that promised land, if you want to make peace with them, you can. You go for it. And so here, those are specifically not people that you ever hear from really again. Again, like you don't hear about the Gerishites and the Maccathites stirring up trouble or rebellion against Israel or invading them, right? And so these are people that ended up working alongside, participating, living alongside the Israelites. And it may have, you're right, it may have had some negative impact. They might have been worshiping some false gods and bringing that somewhat over here. But they were not the thorn in the side like we'll find with the Philistines, because they're not part of the promised land. And so the Israelites were allowed to make peace from them. So it just kind of mentions that, but don't think that these people have failed because they've not conquered that. It's fine. It does mention the Levites, though. And if you're the tribe of Levi, would you be a little bummed? A little sad, right? Like all these people, Joshua's like, oh, you guys get this land, you guys have this land, you have this land, oh, this is great for agriculture, oh, this is great for shipping, go up there, enjoy that, this is an awesome trade route. Hey, Levites, guess what?
You get nothing.
But they don't get nothing, do they? What do the Levites get?
Well, they got from the offering.
They do.
But they were also in each area, each tribal area, they were giving villages or towns
Yep.
that were there.
Yeah, they would have smaller towns and villages so they could have gardens and pastures. And so the Levites were not exactly homeless. It would be okay. They just were not given, like everybody else, one spot. Instead, they were intermixed with the entire rest of Israel. And we'll look more at that later. But you were saying...
Well, that everything that they needed was provided for, was just given to them.
Right.
Everybody owed them.
Yeah, that tithe that would be given and the offerings after the part that needed to be burnt up completely and could not be eaten by people, then the Levites or the priests would be able to eat their portion as well. And so they were well provided for. They were well taken care of. And of course, they had little settlements as well.
It begs the question on the east side of the
Jordan River, yeah.
Jordan River. If that was not part of the promised land, why did the Israelites include it
Well,
to those 2.5 tribes or so?
yeah, that was back in Deuteronomy. That originally, I'm not sure what they would have done, but these tribes that have conquered the land, they begged Israel and begged God to be able to give them that. And
So they themselves,
yeah,
for whatever reason, those tribes said, we don't want the west part, we want this eastern land.
right. And it's going to cause a controversy because in the identification and formation of Israel, are they really part of Israel? Because they're not part of the promised land. And well, the answer obviously is yes. But for them, back in that day, it was a huge, huge issue that nearly caused a civil war very early on in their development. And we're going to look at that at the very end of Joshua here.
I take exception to saying that the Levites were just given it. The Levites worked, and it was like their wages.
Right.
It wasn't like they were just sitting there doing nothing, because to sacrifice all those animals and to clean up, and
Right.
I mean, that was a horrible job, in my opinion. I wouldn't want it. You
Yeah.
know, to kill all those animals and the blood and the.
You're absolutely right. It's kind of like, having the assumption that our Pastor Jonathan, just, reads the Bible, prays a little bit, and then stands up on Sunday to give a message. He does a lot.
Yeah.
And everything that we've got, Levites are not exactly like pastors today, but there's a lot of corollaries. And yeah, he's serving the Lord. The Levites were serving the Lord, and very good servants that you don't hear about. There's sinners. All of us are sinners. But man, they serve, as a tribe, served God very, very well. No? Okay. Yes.
Well, plus it was imperative that they be distributed among the people,
Yeah.
right? So they couldn't be given a territorial allotment anyway if they were to be living among all the people of Israel.
Yeah, more will be in the Judah area, especially when they move the tabernacle from Shechem down to Shiloh, and then, is it the other way around? And then eventually they build the temple in Jerusalem. But yeah, they are spread out everywhere, and it's a very good thing. It's actually needed. So that's a good point. And I'll just read Deuteronomy 18, 1 through 2, and it goes into this a little bit more for the Levites. Deuteronomy 18, 1 through 2 says, "The Levitical priests, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the Lord's food offerings as their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among their brothers, The Lord is their inheritance, as he promised them. And so, in a very material way, you look at this and you're like, man, they're getting the short end of the stick, but they are not. God himself is their inheritance. And that's the best kind of inheritance you can have. Now, for us, we might go through this life and not have, much of an inheritance to leave our kids or our grandkids or great-grandkids. But there's one great inheritance and legacy that you have been living out and you can leave, which is that faith, following the Lord, and hopefully leaving that to your kids. Ultimately, it's up to your kids, their grandkids, and so forth, whether they choose the Lord or not. But man, what an inheritance. Even if you don't leave behind a single penny, if you've left that, that's the best kind of inheritance. By the way, so don't feel like if you're approaching the end of your years, 10, 20, 30 years down the road, and the Lord's preparing to take you, and you're like, man, I wish I left more behind. If you're leaving that legacy behind, you have not failed. You're giving the Levitical inheritance, the blessing of the Lord to your descendants. Lastly, I'm not going to go through this entire part of the chapter, the last part of chapter 13, and I hadn't planned to either, but it goes through and it instructs how Moses gave the inheritance, and he allotted this as well. And so Joshua basically is doing the same thing in chapter 12 and then the chapters after this as Moses did on this eastern side, where he said, okay, these are your boundaries, these are your towns, these are your living areas, and so they're organizing themselves as well. And this is setting up chapter 14. It's going to shift from the eastern section that or most of these two chapters focus on to the western section. The western section, over here, it's mostly conquered. Western section, there's a lot of conflict still. And there's one man that we're going to really focus on next week. We might actually look at it over 2 chapters, is Caleb. Caleb is not an Israelite. But he is an Israelite, right? He's been with Joshua. He's one of the 2 faithful spies. He acts like an Israelite in every way. He has a faith of an Israelite, but genetically, by descent, he is not an Israelite. And so this is going to further the Israelites' understanding of who Israel is. Now, the disadvantage of not being an Israelite, what would this mean for Caleb and his family's inheritance in the land?
Would be none.
They get nothing. But they do get something. And it's not just something of the inheritance of the Lord like the Levites have. He has that, of course, and he leaves that. His nephew is the first judge of Israel. Omri, he comes from that family line, so they leave that godly legacy, but he's also given land, and it also goes and extends to his family just like Israel, because he becomes Israel even though he is not originally Israel. It's kind of like us. Let's go ahead and pray. Lord, thank you that even though we are not the children of Abraham, that we are adopted in under the covenant. We are adopted in because you meant that from the very beginning with Abraham, Lord, for his seed to be a blessing for the whole world, Lord. And we know that Jesus Christ truly is, Lord, that he is the best inheritance that we can possibly have. And we just thank you so much for bringing us to faith. Thank you for saving us, and thank you for giving us the freedom to live in this beautiful, wonderful country, Lord. Help us not take it for granted, but to see the many blessings you've given us, to leave that faithful legacy and that legacy of faith to our descendants. And Lord, for if anyone here today has descendants that are struggling in their walk with you and in their faith, or whether to believe or not, just pray that you give them encouragement, that you help them know that you're real, that you love them, and that they need to walk with you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.